Hello, I'm Perrin Beatty, President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to the Business of Business, a video series where we look at some of the biggest challenges and opportunities facing Canadian businesses today. Well, today I'm joined by Cynthia Leach, who's the Senior Director of Economic Thought Leadership at RBC, to talk about Canada's climate journey and what's in store for Canadian businesses as we transition towards a net zero future and economy. Now, in her role at RBC, Cynthia helped shape the narratives and research agenda around the RBC economics and thought leadership team's forward-looking economic and policy analysis, covering topics such as the future of work, innovation, and the net zero transition. Cynthia, welcome to the Business of Business. We're delighted to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's get straight to the questions. Canada has some of the most ambitious net zero targets anywhere in the world. But we're in the midst of an historic series of geopolitical and industry events that are forcing business leaders to rethink their approaches to climate. How will we reconcile these ambitious goals with the new realities that both business and government are confronting?
Absolutely. Well, I think with current events, up to the current point, the big question has been around the government's release very soon of its statutory emissions reduction plan for 2030. And a key question for that has been the decarbonization of the oil and gas sector, because about 25% of our emissions right now are in that sector. And despite intensity improvements, emissions have gone up because production has gone up. So if we think about something like the oil sands, which is a good share of those emissions, it's a tough to abate sector, and it runs through carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which is an expensive technology. It takes a long time to build. And then the question is how competitive that oil will be at the end. So aggressive targets, if we set for that sector, that does not take account of the lead time and the need to draw financial capital to that space, it could mean even production shutting down. So now we have this geopolitical overlay where Western producers are looking to supplant displaced Russian production with more stable and friendly supplies. And Canada, as the fourth largest oil producer in the world, could be a big part of that solution in the short term and the long term. But it would mean more production and more emissions. It would displace Russian emissions, presumably, but it would still count toward our carbon ledger. So this is a short-term issue that Canada needs to sort out, and a key part of the context around climate discussions right now. But longer term, we know for that sector, like many other sectors, we're going to need a net zero sector to be competitive and to meet our climate goals. So the other thing with the current context draws attention to is the need for decarbonization to insulate consumers, households, and businesses from this volatility in the energy transition. And it means accelerating renewables or EVs. Ultimately, while 2050 is a very long way away, there are some critical choices that we need to make now to meet our climate and energy security objectives. And we need to decide on the best path forward and ensure that all the pieces are in place to get there. And that's what we like to think about.
So this is a very significant challenge. Are you satisfied that today we are on top of this in terms of reconciling these competing interests? And in fact, in your view, is it possible to reconcile them, to be able to achieve our goals without inflicting serious economic damage on ourselves?
It's not an easy trade-off. There appear to be some trade-offs, and where you might need to sacrifice some of your targets in the short term for energy security. But I think it's absolutely important that the long-term objective of a net zero sector and a net zero Canadian economy is really important, not just for our climate objectives and the existential threat of climate change, but also to have a competitive economy for the future.
So the goal is not in doubt. It is how we get there that's the issue that we have to wrestle with.
Absolutely.
But keeping on the topic of climate, RBC has been devoting a good deal of research to Canada's climate challenge. And can you give us a quick recap of some of the work that your team has done over the course of the past several months? Because you've really done some pioneering work here.
Thank you. Yeah, well, we hope to inform and inspire smart climate action. And we think as a bank on our own decarbonization journey and, dealing with so many clients and businesses across this country and internationally that we have some interesting insights on the issue. So we're thinking, like many people, about what are Canada's decarbonization pathways and what's needed to get there. Our big seminal report came out last fall called the $2 trillion transition. And it talked about the climate action imperative, Canada's emissions math. It's really a very useful primer for those who are a little intimidated by the sometimes wonkish climate space. So it breaks it down in an easy to understand way. And it talks about the pathways in different sectors, noting that in some sectors like buildings, the technology is net zero ready. So it's about drawing the capital and solving some other problems. In other areas, like the oil sector or agriculture, it's a little bit more challenging. And we're going to need some technological development and innovation in order to understand how to abate those sectors. So our further work going forward is going to expand and look at some of these sectoral challenges in more detail. And we have planned this year actually something on oil sands decarbonization we hope will be out very soon, and something on agriculture planned for later this fall. But key to any of these things is thinking about the ingredients needed to get to our goal. And so there are a few of these ingredients. It's, we need the targets, and we seem to have those. We need the technology. Sometimes we have it, and not in all places. We need the policy to encourage behavioral changes and to develop those technologies. We need the financial capital. That's actually the inspiration of the title for the $2 trillion transition. That's our estimated, with many assumptions, cost of reaching net zero today. That translated into investment spending of about 60 to 80 billion additional dollars a year. And then a key ingredient that we think doesn't get enough attention is we need the human capital. And that's why we wrote a report last month or a couple months ago called Green Collar Jobs, focusing on the skills and green job shift coming for the Canadian economy and what we need to do to ensure we're ready.
I was fascinated by that report. The Green Collar Jobs report is, in this area as in so many others, the issue of skills comes into it, and the need for us to really modernize the toolkit that we have available to be able to meet the challenges we're facing. Your report includes some pretty dramatic findings about how the world of work is being affected. Can you touch on some of the areas where we'll see the most significant impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, when we think of green jobs, I think it runs the gamut. You think about, accountants that will need to audit emissions as well as financial statements. City planners are going to have to ensure that urban infrastructure is resilient to the impact of frequent floods, or logistics managers having to understand how to optimize or minimize emissions from a certain delivery route. So we find that about 3.1 million Canadian jobs, or about 15% of the workforce, will see a significant shift in their skills over the next 5 to 10 years as the climate transition takes shape. And that's assuming today's targets and ambitions. And so that number could go up to the extent we see an acceleration or an increase in our ambitions. So it's 15% of the workforce and about 400,000 new jobs in these green skill fields over the next 5 years or so. We find this transition will affect about 8 of 10 major economic sectors. And for some, as you might expect, that transition is going to be a bit more significant. The skill shift will be more significant. So we find that of these, 400,000 new jobs, some of them will be for transportation, energy, and manufacturing, where those new jobs, about 40% of them will require an enhanced skill set. And then if you look at an area like managers, for managers as a whole, we find that about 10% of the skill shift, 10% of their tasks will shift because of the green transition. But if we dive deeper into managers and green managers, it's about 25%. And then if you look at really specialist managers like engineers or architects who will be working on green projects, that'll be about 50%. So it's a big number, and the scale varies, the intensity of that shift varies a lot across the economy.
You add that challenge on top of all of the other changes that are roiling the economy and creating challenges for Canadian businesses, and it's quite dramatic. We have a lot of small businesses tuning in today, and your report takes note of the fact that it's very important for employers, and particularly for SMEs, to have support in developing their climate skills strategies. You've set out some of the scope of the challenge that's being faced by employers here. Can you talk a bit more about that, particularly as it relates to small businesses and some of the elements that need to be made a priority for small businesses in particular?
For sure. Let me first speak to like the role of employers, I think, in this green skill shift. One of the, the very interesting findings of a report is that unlike some of the other big skill shift in the economy, like the digital, imparted by digitization, which is affecting more low skill, low wage workers, we find that at least at this early part of the transition, this climate or green skill shift is actually impacting more high wage, high skill workers. And, in a lot of ways, that's a good story because this is a big upskilling challenge. And we know that those workers tend to have more access to training than other workers in the economy. And in general, we found that businesses are going to have to take a really big role in this upskilling just because of the nature of this transition and where we are. So these are sometimes new technologies, competitive processes, taking new technologies and bolting them on with a lot of effort to an existing process or supply chain. And so undoubtedly employers, they talk to us about taking, university graduates and teaching them these new skills on the job. But if we think about where we are now and where we need to be, a lot of the next 10 years has to be about finding scale in our climate journey. And that includes finding scale in our green skills. And so while businesses need to take the lead, I think we need to increasingly find what the complementary role of government, post-secondary institutions can be to support and accelerate that. And within that, remembering that small business is going to feel this climate transition too. At RBC, we've done some survey work of our small business clients and find that it's definitely a bit lower down the priority list, but we don't think it's going to stay there for long. Also because a lot of larger enterprises rate climate as an important issue, and to understand their emissions, they need to understand their suppliers. And so that's going to feed down into small businesses. And yet, small businesses have other challenges, including big pandemic debt loads, historically dealing with major supply chain issues and labor shortages, and, having challenged, in some cases been challenged historically to find the time to dedicate to these type of, newer change initiatives. And, we need to find a way to support this sector to increase awareness of the climate imperative, for them to understand their emissions and what's in their scope of action to impact, and then helping them find solutions to plan and implement those changes. And that absolutely includes on the skills side.
And I suppose the important thing is to differentiate between the ability to simply buy these skills in as you're hiring new people and the need to constantly upgrade the skills of your existing workforce. So what you're talking about is something which is demands that are constantly changing. And this is going to put new needs for new skills on the existing workforces of businesses in Canada.
Absolutely, that's a key differentiator. We're not just going to grow out of this issue, if you will, and it's all about just ensuring the next generation of workers has the right skills. This transition is coming harder and faster than that. We're going to have to ensure that people in the workforce today, in many different, 8 of these 10 different occupational sectors across the economy, have new skills to address these challenges. And at a time when, we have historic labor shortages and, we're already facing many other things that are leading to skill shift and job changes in the economy, and those type of frictions in the economy can really weigh on our economic growth and prosperity. So it's also, we can't be reactive in doing this. We've got to be planning ahead as businesses, as governments, as post-secondary institutions, and as workers with the right mindset for that change.
What you're saying brings us back to really one of the earlier questions I was asking. You and your colleagues have also done a tremendous amount of work on Canada's economic growth challenges. Can you talk about the intersection of Canada's economic challenges like labor supply issues that we have today, 1 million jobs going begging in Canada, and how they're running up against our climate challenge and how we can reconcile these competing needs? At the end of the day, we've got to find a formula where we can achieve these critical strategic goals. But the question is, how do we get there from here?
Yeah, I wrote a piece last fall talking about this, that we've experienced thus far a bounce back from the depths of the pandemic, economically speaking. But really, we're still on track to settle down to what has been our recent historical trend growth rate, which is pretty low relative to history, because we have this low trend labor supply growth related to population aging that even ambitious immigration targets cannot help us entirely avoid. And two, we've had low productivity performance in this country and lagging relative to our peers for many years. And that's related to our kind of lagging record on business investment and on productivity performance and innovation. And so I think climate could be a challenge because of what we just spoke about, that we need these new skills and new bodies in some cases in these green sectors and in these green jobs. But we have to find a way to make the best use of our existing workforce and to be bringing in the skilled talent and making more use of the talent that we haven't made use of, such as, we see underemployment in immigrant groups and visible minorities and Indigenous communities. How can we better use all those sources of talent to address this issue? And then the second thing is that climate could really be an opportunity to increase business investment. I spoke earlier about the need for $60 to $80 billion a year in spending on climate. We're more in the $15 to $20 billion range by some assumptions and math. So we have a long way to go, and that could really be a force for changing the trajectory of Canada's business investment. And we think with the right policy supports and attitude could also make a big dent in the innovation and productivity record.
Final question. If people want to learn more about this fascinating work that you folks have done in this area on green skills or a wide range of other areas of thought leadership, where do they go to get that information?
RBC Economics or RBC Thought Leadership. We have a climate hub there. And we also have a great podcast called Disruptors, where we explore many different issues, disruptive issues to the economy. And we have a great series on climate and a new one coming. So we hope those will be inspiring and informative resources.
Cynthia, it's been fascinating. Thank you for your work, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. Great questions.